Alright class, so this video we're going to talk about population genetics. So we kind of have intro evolution stuff out of the way. So now we're going to kind of dive down more into what's going on within a population that would result in evolution. Okay, so population genetics, right? So this is going to be looking at changes in the gene pool, changes in the gene pool of a population. Right, so gene pool idea, the gene pool is basically just a pool of all the genes in the population. So remember, genes occur in alleles, right? Different forms. We call those alleles, like dominant or recessive or big A, little a. So all of those in a population is what we're following here. And we're looking at changes within that population. Important to point out again here, remember in the very first video I mentioned to you that the unit of evolution is the population, right? So even when we say we're going to dive down into it a little deeper now, we're still looking at the population level, right? Like your genes in your lifetime aren't going to change. Now technically that's not absolutely correct because there are some things like radiation and that kind of deal that could technically change some DNA in some of your cells. But, you know, generically speaking, within our lifetime, our DNA is not changing. So it's the DNA in the whole population. And then we're looking at this over time, right? Changes in the gene pool of a population. And we're talking generation to generation. Right? So remember when we did genetics, our generation that we started with was the parent or the P generation. And then offspring, we used F and then a number. So P made F1, F1 made F2, F2 made F3, etc. So that's what we're talking about here is generation to generation. And you know, evolution's a slow process, so it's not something we see from F1 to F3, right? So we could technically be talking about like F2 billion, right? So that long generation to generation gradual change in our gene pool. All right, so in population genetics, we're going to look at a few numbers. Okay, we're going to look at what are called genotype frequencies. Okay, so think of frequencies here. It's just like how abundant something is, right? So like the percent of something. And then remember our genotypes. We're sticking with like basic simple inheritance stuff here. So our genotypes would be like homozygous dominant, heterozygous, homozygous recessive. So we could be looking at the percentages of each of those genotypes within our population. Okay, and then ultimately what we really want to look at for this is the allele frequencies. Okay, so it's not so much how much of the population is homozygous dominant, it's how many genes in our gene pool are dominant or recessive, right? So here we'd be looking at just percent for big A and little a. That's really what we're trying to get to, right? The allele frequency stuff is what we're really using in population genetics. Okay, and studying these allele frequencies in population genetics lets us look at what's called microevolution. Okay, so use in population genetics to study microevolution. All All right, so we mentioned microevolution earlier, very first video, and now we can tie it back in, and we can actually just sort of go backwards with what we have here to define it. So, we're saying we use allele frequencies to study microevolution. Okay, so what microevolution is going to be is a change in allele frequencies. Okay, so that's what we're looking for with microevolution, small scale changes in populations. What we're really looking at is changes to the gene pool. And to follow that, what we really positively have to look at are these allele frequencies. All right, so I want to show you a couple other things with these allele frequencies. So, yeah, we've got to do some math with this, but that's not my favorite thing. So if I can do this math, I'm positive you all can. It's pretty easy, straightforward stuff. Right, so if we have these two alleles, big A and little a, if we take those and combine them, that has to equal 100% of all the alleles. Right, that just makes sense. Right, those are assuming those are the only two alleles we have for some particular character in this population, then those things have to add up to 100%. Right? So if big A is 25% of all the alleles, then little a has to be 75%. Right? Always got to add up to 100%. Right? No exception for that. That's what we have to add up to. And now when we really study population genetics, we typically don't do percentages, we do decimals. So when we really look at this in the field of population genetics, what we say is big A plus little a has to equal 1. Right? So we're saying that it's decimals that add up to 1. So then what that means is still the same thing, that if big A is 0.25, little a is 0.75, and it adds up to 1. Big B is 0.73, little b is 0.27. Right, still got to add up to 1. Right, so that's kind of what we're going to see with population genetics and allele frequencies. Okay, so then I want to show you one more thing, and then I'll tell you what can happen to change these allele frequencies. So when we look at this, there was a question or two in the pre-lecture on something called Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. And when we look at that for real in population genetics, there's this thing called the Hardy-Weinberg equation. And I'm going to show you this equation, but I'm not going to explain the whole thing in detail. So it's the Hardy-Weinberg equation is the quantity p plus q squared equals 1. Now we can expand this binomial and look at terms and what all those things mean. Bottom line is what I really want to tell you with this is that p is representing a dominant allele and q is representing a recessive allele. Okay, so I'm going to try to keep stuff that I'm showing you when we're dealing with, I'm going to try to keep stuff looking like this up here, where we're just saying big B, little b. But occasionally I might use P and Q, and you might also see that in the textbook where it's using this equation and using P and Q. So if you see P and Q, don't get confused with it. It's just still dominant or recessive. Right? Depending on whatever letter we're using, it means the same thing. All right, so then last part of this is if microevolution is changing allele frequencies, what I want to tell you is what can change allele frequencies. Okay, so let's kind of wrap this up by saying if that's what we're looking for to decide if there's microevolution, right? We're looking to see, are these allele frequencies changing, yes or no? Okay, so we got to look at the list of what can cause that. So here's the major stuff that can cause allele frequencies to change. Natural selection, right? If a trait is getting selected more, whatever gene is representing that trait is selected more. That can change those percentages. Okay, mutations. Okay, mutations, you know, we've been saying we have two options, dominant recessive, big A, little a. Well, the mutation's going to make a new allele. So what if now we have big A, little a, and X? Well, those three things now have to add up to 100%, so something's got to change. Okay, something called genetic drift. Okay, we had this in the pre-lecture. Genetic drift is the random loss of alleles. So this would be things like, think natural catastrophe things. So if a volcano erupted or a hurricane hits a kind of small island, then the things that are not going to make it through those events, that's random, right? So it's not like, obviously this is stupid, but this is always what I mention with this stuff in classes is think about if you have that volcanic eruption, the volcanic eruption doesn't go, oh, you know what, I'm going to kill every plant with purple flowers. Like, duh, I can't do that, right? So it erupts, and whatever doesn't make it doesn't make it. It's completely random. That's the deal with genetic drift. Okay, and then the last one is something called gene flow. So this gene flow is like immigration, emigration, right? If we have a population here, gene flow is stuff leaving, organisms leaving that population, organisms coming into that population. So the frequencies can change depending on what alleles those individuals are carrying. All right, so that's the stuff that can change our allele frequencies.